David Berman, a retired professor at Trinity College, Dublin, has written that there's nothing more important than to work out what your absolute desire is and then to go in that direction, which is a challenge, I think, to sort out what you care about most. So among your concerns, what tops the list? What, if anything, stands out? Do you have some ultimate concern or greatest desire or highest wish? Or perhaps you'd rather not think in such stark terms. You'd rather not narrow things down like that. You'd perhaps prefer not to ground your life in some sort of absolute defining consideration, but instead hope to live your life in much broader terms, which I hope does not mean for you the loosey-goosey attitude of subscribing to being open to everything while believing nothing, a broad-mindedness that amounts to a sort of hazy, stoned-like state of mind, floundering around in a relativistic haze, which in my estimate is precisely where you end up if you do not live your life in a resolutely focused way, based on some supreme consideration. So I call it living in the gray zone, or better, falling into the gray zone. For to end up in the gray zone is not the result of some great aspiration, but rather is the sorry outcome of failing to work out carefully just what your absolute desire is. So that fall into colorlessness is the failure not to ground your life in relation to an absolute reference point. The fall into the emptiness of the gray zone is related, I think, to living a life that's not about anything in particular, sort of all over the place. And that's the nature of an empty life, that it's but a mishmash of odds and ends of all kinds of desires, none of which are high enough or strong enough or commanding enough to put you together into a state of coherence and integrity. Now, the Upanishads are instructive here on the necessity of manning up to choose between lower desires and higher ones. Nachiketa is a young seeker and is told by his teacher, Nachiketa, as a human being, you've been born with the capacity to make choices. The Guru is saying to Nachiketa that his dignity as a human being is his inborn capacity to discriminate between lower and higher desires. No other creature has this capacity, and no human being can avoid this responsibility. And so at every moment, he says to Nachiketa, you have a choice between two alternatives about what you will do, what you will say, and what you think. You get to choose, in other words, between what he calls the pleasant way or the beneficial way. That is, you can go low or you can aim high. You can give in to momentary satisfactions, or you can choose to focus all of your mind, heart, and soul upon that which endures. In dietary terms, you can get fat and sluggish, or you can aim to be slim and trim, fit. An experiment on mice makes the point. There was one group of mice were given simple food and a wheel to run on. They lived a sort of simple Spartan-like mice existence. The other group of mice were given lots of variety. There was a mouse playground with food and mirrors and other mouse buddies and tubes and materials for nesting fun. Well, the results were revelatory. The test results indicated that the unfocused mice became, over time, more and more vulnerable to Alzheimer's, whereas in contrast, the focused Spartan mice warriors in their simple environment were better able to ward off disease, which reinforces the point I'm making that a single-minded focus and discipline is of inestimable value in every way. In the same way, a successful marriage is the result of that absolute commitment of to you alone forsaking all others, like a singular focus. What's required, therefore, if we're to live well, is to put into action exactly what the Irish professor David Berman is emphasizing, which is, I repeat, to find out what your absolute desire is and then resolutely to live in accordance with it. Otherwise, a fall into the gray zone is inevitable. As in the case of the philosopher David Hume, who missed his own life's greatest possibility, as he himself admitted late in life, when he expressed that his own absolute desire had been to aspire no higher than to hope for mere worldly recognition. Thus, in the final year of his life, Hume wrote about, quote, my love of literary fame, my ruling passion. Now, George Berkeley is a marked contrast to Hume and chose to emphasize something much different. Berkeley's own absolute desire was to attain truth and describes his search for truth as what he calls a feverish expectancy. Well, that absolute desire for truth still burned within him as an old man. In his memoir, for instance, he references Plato's allegory of getting out of the cave of ignorance to ascend into the realm of truth. So these two philosophers exhibited entirely different tones. Hume presents himself as some kind of content man, urbane and polite. Berkeley, in contrast, is feverish in his search for truth. Now, the long-term effect of Hume's so-called self-contentment, as Berman points out, has been instrumental in leading the way to what Berman calls that orientation of mind where truth has ceased to be the cry of all. Like he's the father of modern skepticism. Berkeley's long-term effect, in contrast, has been to keep the cry for truth alive. Now, when it comes to giving expression to my own absolute desire, I'd say that my absolute desire has to do with the aspiration I've always felt for a certain quality of relationship. I've somehow all my life been searching for that quality of relationship that is on fire with a shared yearning for transcendence. It's to share in common with another that deep longing or yearning to establish contact with a divine reference point at the heart of all things, as I've expressed elsewhere through the image of a triangle. At the base of the triangle on either side are two persons who've come together because of matching interests and concerns. But my question has always been about any kind of relationship or friendship or marriage, like how high and deep will you go together? Like, is the effect of your coming together, is the effect of your friendship a joint movement towards the triangle's peak, which is understood to be the highest, the absolute God, or not? The Upanishads reinforce my point by emphasizing that what's dear about any relationship is whether it creates and inspires a mutual elevation towards the highest point of the triangle. Thus, in the terms of the Upanishads, no relationship exists for its own sake, but for the sake of the self, for the sake of God, of moving towards the absolute, towards the ultimate. So no relationship, in other words, is simply about the here and now, but is about going beyond itself into transcendental dimensions. So, as it says, a wife loves her husband, not for his own sake, but for the sake of the self, for the sake of the higher dimension. A husband loves his wife, not for her sake, but for the sake of the self. Parents love their children, not for the sake of the children, but for the sake of the self. People love wealth not for its own sake, but for the sake of the self. Thinkers and teachers are loved not for their own sake, but for the sake of the self. Warriors and kings are loved not for their own sake, but for the sake of the self. The gods, the worlds, the beings in the world, and everything else, they are not loved for their own sake, but for the sake of the self. Indeed, the Upanishad concludes, you must realize the self. You must realize the highest, the absolute. Hear it, reflect upon it, and meditate upon it. So the point of a relationship, the point of a friendship, the point of a marriage is always to go beyond what it is to what it could be. The point is to affirm eternal dimensions as over against mere temporal dimensions. Now, since my own absolute desire is for this kind of, or this level of spiritual relationship, my question then becomes, what philosophies support such a quest? Well, the Irish philosopher has broadly stated that we've got a choice between two schools of thinking. The first of these is that school of thinkers who associate themselves with the family of Plato, the other with the Buddha. Now, it's been clear to me since reading Plato as a teenager that Platonism supports my absolute desire for relationship with the divine because it affirms the possibility of personal deification. Platonism affirms personal transcendence. For the Buddhists, however, the absolute desire is in terms of absolute nothingness. And thus the Buddhist approach is to overcome individuality and personality. Like it's the opposite. It's actually the goal of Buddhist practice to blot out your hopes and desires out of existence entirely. All personal striving is to be abandoned in order to attain a condition of impersonal being or nothingness. And so from its point of view, the individual self is ephemeral. Your individual self is an illusion. Your individual self is a fiction. Your individual self is regarded as but an appearance of the one only being. In these terms, therefore, your absolute desire is to lose any sense of a personal self and to identify instead with Brahman, or the nothingness of nirvana, the attraction to which is hard to comprehend. And yet this is exactly what the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer decided to focus upon. So as he lay dying, he declared that his absolute desire was to attain absolute nothingness, which is why I suppose he's regarded as one of the most pessimistic philosophers who ever lived, and whose writings therefore will never be put under the Christmas tree for my granddaughters to read for inspiration. But as soon as these girls are old enough, I can hardly wait to read Plato to them, for the Platonic understanding is of the self that is indivisible. A person is an individual person or substance among other similar beings. Platonism is affirming personality, is affirming personal destiny. It affirms that this life is not all there is, but it's a journey of you as you towards the eternal. It's so clear that these two positions, the Platonic one and the Buddhist one, are radically opposed. And well, my conviction is no synthesis is possible between such diametrically opposed positions. You can't merge these two things together, for if you do, all you have is some mushy, meaningless muddle and mushy middle. Now, an insufficient ground, therefore, if that's the case, upon which to build a meaningful and purposeful life. So it's no wonder then that the New Testament is affirming of the Platonic emphasis on personal destiny, as it repeatedly emphasizes in the pages of the New Testament that when the light shone on anyone, that the effect of the light was that it transfigured, not blotted out. The New Testament's accent is not about blotting out your desires, extinguishing your desires, but to heighten your desires to the point that your absolute desire is to dwell forever in union with God. Like it's a high, holy, pure desire. Thus, the effect of Christ's presence is to bring the human being to his senses, to bring him or her to himself or herself. The impact of Jesus Christ is to establish you in your own distinct and particular identity. And therefore, a man so inspired is absolutely bursting with holy desire, with a longing, with a yearning so great that nothing else compares to it. In Platonic Christian terms, therefore, our life journey is not towards disillusion or nothingness or a collapse into the void, but is rather a movement towards transfiguration and glorification. This view, the New Testament one, is an absolute contrast to any philosophy that diminishes the self by referencing it as only a mere reflection or shadow or condensation of the divine or a minor aspect of God's existence. My own absolute desire in fully Christian terms is to live eternally in the presence of that one, Jesus Christ my Lord, who loved me and gave himself for me.